Imagine standing inside the trembling aluminum hull of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 30,000 feet. The air outside is so cold that exposed skin would freeze in seconds. The engines scream against the thin atmosphere. Beneath you, obscured by churning cloud cover in the thick industrial haze of occupied Europe, lies a target, a factory, a rail yard, a bridge, that must be destroyed to shorten a war that has already consumed millions of lives. You cannot see it. You cannot be certain your bombs will land within a mile of it. But you carry with you a secret so carefully guarded that airmen were ordered to die rather than let it fall into enemy hands. You carry a device that its creators claimed could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 5 miles in the sky. This is the story of the Norden Bombsight, the most classified piece of military technology the United States possessed at the outset of World War II. It was a machine, born of idealism, engineered with extraordinary precision, and deployed into a war that would test every assumption its creators had made. It was, depending on how one measured success, either the most important invention of the war or one of history's most consequential overestimates. The year is 1940. Europe is already burning. Germany's Luftwaffe has demonstrated in Poland and France that air power can reshape the battlefield in days. Britain stands alone against the Nazi war machine, its cities absorbing nightly punishment from the skies. In Washington and in the war colleges of the American military, planners are watching, calculating, preparing for the war they know is coming. American military doctrine, particularly within the Army Air Corps, had been built around a single, foundational belief that wars could be won from the air, not through the indiscriminate carpet bombing that some foreign powers practice, but through surgical, precise strikes against the industrial machinery that kept an enemy functioning. Destroy the ball-bearing factories, the oil refineries, the rail networks, and the enemy's war machine would grind to a halt. The soldiers on the ground would have little left to fight. This doctrine was known as strategic bombing, and its entire premise rested on the idea that American bombers, flying in daylight, could hit specific targets from high altitude with enough accuracy to make the doctrine work. The weapon that would make this possible, the instrument that would transform strategic bombing from a theory into a reality, was already waiting. It had been under development for more than a decade. Its inventor had given it his name, and the United States government had spent years and fortunes refining it into something that felt almost miraculous. The world was about to discover whether the miracle was real. Carl Norden was not an American by birth. He was a Dutch engineer, born in 1880. In Java, then part of the Dutch East Indies, educated in Switzerland, and shaped by the precise, unforgiving culture of European mechanical engineering. He came to the United States in 1904 and found work that suited his temperament perfectly, designing gyroscopes and stabilizers for the United States Navy. Norden was obsessive, exacting, and famously difficult to work with, a man who believed that there was one right answer to every engineering problem, and that he usually knew what it was. In the early 1920s, Norden began work on an idea that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. He wanted to build an analog computing device, a machine that could, in real time, account for the speed of the aircraft, its altitude, the crosswind, the drift of the plane, and the ballistic properties of the bomb itself, and then calculate with mathematical precision the exact moment the bomb should be released to hit a given point on the ground below. The technical challenge was staggering. The bombardier using the device would need to identify the target through a telescopic sight, track it as the aircraft moved, feed corrections into the mechanism continuously, and trust that when the device signaled the release point, the calculations had been done correctly. All of this at altitude, under fire, with engines vibrating the aircraft and turbulence throwing off every measurement. Norden solved these problems one by one over years of methodical work. The device he produced was a marvel of precision machining, a gyroscopically stabilized optical sight, connected to an analog electromechanical computer. Hundreds of gears, cams, and linkages worked in concert to perform calculations that would have taken a mathematician minutes to solve. It weighed 65 pounds. It was about the size of a large sewing machine. And it was, in the estimation of the Army Air Corps officers who tested it over the clear skies of the California desert in the 1930s, almost impossibly accurate. Test results were extraordinary. Under ideal conditions, clear skies, steady aircraft, no enemy interference, the Norden Bombsight could achieve a circular error probable of just 100 feet or less from altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet. To a military establishment accustomed to bombing accuracy measured in hundreds or thousands of feet, this seemed like a revolution. The United States government responded accordingly. The Norden Bombsight was classified at the highest level. Blueprints were locked away. Production was restricted to a small number of trusted manufacturers, and the bombardiers who trained on the device were required to take a solemn oath, swearing on their honor, and on pain of court-martial, that they would never allow the bombsight to fall into enemy hands. In the event of a forced landing or crash over enemy territory, they were expected to destroy the device with a thermite grenade before anything else, before helping wounded crewmates, before attempting to save themselves. The oath was not taken lightly. The men who swore it understood what it meant. The United States was betting its entire air war strategy on the assumption that this device, this mechanical brain with its gyroscopes and gears, could do what no bombing campaign in history had ever managed to do, hit exactly what it aimed at, from the edge of the stratosphere, in the middle of a war. When the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, the Army Air Forces, as the Corps had been renamed, began deploying in force to England. The buildup was massive. Airfields across the English countryside were transformed into staging grounds for a campaign that planners called the Combined Bomber Offensive. The British Royal Air Force would bomb at night, accepting imprecision in exchange for the protection of darkness. The Americans would bomb in daylight, relying on the Norden Bombsight to compensate for the vulnerability that daylight brought. The first American heavy bombing missions over occupied Europe began in the summer of 1942. They were modest in scale, probing missions against targets in France and the Low Countries, designed to test doctrine against reality. The early results were encouraging enough to justify expansion. By 1943, the 8th Air Force, based in England, was mounting missions deep into Germany itself, against the synthetic oil plants at Ploesti, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, the aircraft production facilities at Regensburg. The missions were brutal. German air defenses had learned quickly that the Americans were coming in daylight, in formations that were visible for miles, on predictable paths to their targets. Flak batteries were positioned along the likely approach routes. Luftwaffe fighter wings, equipped with the lethal Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, climbed to meet the formations before they reached the target and stayed with them until fuel forced them to turn back. American losses were catastrophic. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943 became synonymous with the human cost of the daylight campaign. On October 14, 1943, a day that would become known as Black Thursday, 291 B-17s set out for the ball-bearing factories. 60 aircraft were shot down. 500 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. That was nearly a quarter of the attacking force, lost in a single day. And the factories they had targeted were damaged but not destroyed. Yet within these cauldrons of fire and steel, the Norden Bombsight was performing its function. Bombardiers crouched over their eyepieces, tracking targets through the telescopic sight, feeding corrections with practiced hands, watching the crosshairs drift toward the release point. The mechanical computer ran its calculations, accounting for variables that would have defeated any human doing the arithmetic manually. At the computed moment, the device triggered the release. Bombs fell. Whether they fell where they were supposed to was a separate question, one that reconnaissance photography was beginning to answer in ways that some in the high command found uncomfortable. The problem was not the bombsight itself. In the sterile mathematics of the testing range, the device performed as advertised. The problem was everything else. European weather, unlike the clear skies of California, was a constant adversary. Cloud cover over targets was the rule, not the exception. High-altitude winds were stronger and less predictable than planners had assumed. And the final approach to the target, the so-called bomb run, required the aircraft to fly straight and level for several minutes while the bombardier acquired and tracked the target. During those minutes, the aircraft could not take evasive action. It had to hold its course while every flak gun in range concentrated its fire on the formation. Bombardiers were doing their jobs with extraordinary courage. The machine was doing everything it had been designed to do. But the gap between controlled test conditions and the chaos of actual combat was proving to be far wider than anyone had wanted to admit. The gap between promise and reality. By mid-1943, the Army Air Force's own post-mission analysis was producing numbers that could no longer be ignored. Reconnaissance photographs of bombed targets were being carefully examined by intelligence analysts, and what they revealed was sobering. Only about 20% of American bombs dropped from high altitude were landing within 1,000 feet of their intended targets. 1,000 feet sounds close until one considers that a factory complex, a rail junction, or an oil refinery might fit within a much tighter radius. Many bombs were falling in open fields, on residential neighborhoods, or simply disappearing into the smoke and haze that obscured targets for much of the year. The Norden Bombsight had been sold to the American public and to Congress as a precision instrument. Newsreel footage showed bombardiers peering through their sights with the confidence of surgeons. Government promotional material spoke of putting a bomb in a pickle barrel. The gap between that promise and the reality over Germany was not merely a technical disappointment, it had strategic and moral dimensions that would resonate for decades. There were missions where the bombsight performed brilliantly. There were formations where the lead bombardier, using a well-maintained sight in relatively clear conditions, achieved accuracy that validated every claim its inventors had made. But these were the exceptions. The average mission, conducted through broken clouds with flak bursting at altitude and fighters slashing through the formation, produced results that were, in the brutal arithmetic of industrial bombing, only marginally better than what could be achieved with less sophisticated equipment. The response to this problem took several forms. One was tactical. Pathfinder units were developed, aircraft equipped with radar bombing systems, the British H-2S and later the American H-2X, that could detect targets through cloud cover. These aircraft would lead formations and drop marker bombs that other aircraft could aim at. Precision gave way to pattern bombing, which gave way, in the worst-case scenarios of heavy overcast, to simply bombing on the radar return of a city-sized target and accepting whatever destruction resulted. Another response was scale. If a single bomb had only a modest probability of hitting any Given target, then the solution was to drop thousands of bombs. The combined bomber offensive intensified through 1944, and the industrial capacity of the United States fed it an unending stream of aircraft and munitions. This was not the surgical campaign the doctrine had promised. It was, increasingly, a campaign of overwhelming industrial force, using quantity to compensate for the precision that could not always be achieved. There was also a decision, taken incrementally and then with gathering momentum, to broaden the definition of legitimate targets. Transportation networks, marshalling yards, airfields, these were clearly military objectives. But they were also embedded in cities. And as the weight of the campaign grew and the pressure to accelerate results increased, the line between attacking infrastructure and attacking the urban areas around it became harder to maintain. The climax of this tension came in the final year of the European War, in the controversy over the strategic bombing campaign itself, debates about Dresden, about Cologne, about the cities of the Ruhr Valley where the industrial heart of Germany had been beaten into rubble by campaigns that bore only a passing resemblance to the precise, discriminate operations that had been promised. The Norden Bombsight was still there, still calculating, still releasing bombs at the mathematically correct moment. But the war it was fighting had become something different from the war it had been built to fight. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. In the months that followed, teams of American, British, and Soviet analysts fanned out across the shattered continent to assess what the bombing campaign had actually achieved. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a massive undertaking involving hundreds of analysts and thousands of interviews with German officials, industrialists, and military officers, produced a comprehensive and often uncomfortable verdict. The bombing campaign had worked, but not in the way its architects had planned. The oil campaign, the sustained assault on synthetic fuel production in the final year of the war, had been devastatingly effective, grounding the Luftwaffe and paralyzing Wehrmacht logistics in the crucial final months. The transportation campaign of 1944 and 1945 had fractured Germany's ability to move troops and supplies at a critical moment. These were genuine strategic achievements of real consequence. But the early years of the campaign, when the Norden bombsight's precision was supposed to surgically remove the ball-bearing industry and the aircraft factories, had produced far less decisive results than promised. The Germans had dispersed their production, found alternative sources, repaired damage with remarkable efficiency, and increased output of critical weapons even under sustained attack. The factories at Schweinfurt, bombed at such terrible cost in 1943, were producing ball bearings again. Within months, Carl Norden himself watched the war from a remove. He had never been an enthusiastic advocate of bombing's human cost. His focus had always been the engineering problem, the mathematics of accuracy. He reportedly expressed distress at how his instrument had been used, how the precision he had strived to achieve had been overwhelmed by the realities of industrial warfare. He died in 1965, his legacy complicated, his invention famous, but also, in the judgment of history, something less than the transformative tool it had been promised to be. The Norden bombsight did eventually find its way into enemy hands, not through the failure of an airman's oath, but through espionage. A German spy named Hermann Lang, who had worked for one of the bombsight's manufacturers in New York, had passed detailed technical information to German intelligence before the war. The Germans had studied the blueprints, assessed the device, and concluded that the technical precision it offered would not compensate for the inherent difficulties of combat bombing. They did not attempt to replicate it. In a curious irony, the United States had spent enormous Resources protecting a secret that, in operational terms, Germany had already evaluated and judged less decisive than its defenders believed. The story of the Norden Bombsight is ultimately a story about the space between technological promise and operational reality. It is a story about how military establishments fall in love with their own innovations, about the dangers of testing weapons in ideal conditions and deploying them in impossible ones. It is a story about doctrine, about how the belief in precision bombing shaped American strategy, led to enormous sacrifice, and ultimately produced a campaign that achieved its goals through means quite different from those originally imagined. It is also, in a longer historical view, the origin story of something that exists today. The dream of precision warfare, the idea that violence can be made surgical, that the right instrument can minimize collateral destruction, did not die with the Norden Bombsight. It lived on through the precision-guided munitions of the Vietnam era, through the laser-guided bombs of the Gulf War, through the GPS-guided weapons and the drone strikes of the 21st century. Each generation has believed it possessed a technology that would finally make war clean, precise, and controllable. Each generation has discovered, in the fullness of combat, that war resists such ambitions. The Norden Bombsight sits today in museums, at the Smithsonian, at the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson, in collections around the country. Under glass free of vibration and flak and cloud cover, it looks exactly like what its inventor intended it to be. A masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a triumph of precision made physical. It is easy, looking at it, to understand why men took oaths to protect it. Easy to understand why generals built a strategy around it. Easy to understand why it was believed to have changed war forever. The harder understanding, the one that history demands, is why the gap between what it promised and what it delivered was so difficult to see, and why, despite all evidence, the dream it embodied has never stopped inspiring the next generation of weapons builders to believe that this time, finally, they have built the machine that will make war precise.